Hello everyone, this video is about legal and ethical issues in assessment, and I will be going over the laws and ethical codes that are relevant to know when we are assessing our clients. So first is a legal concept called scope of practice, and scope of practice basically describes what we are allowed as MFTs to do therapeutically. Okay, so for MFTs, what is within our scope of practice is to interview and observe behavior in order to discover presenting problems, psychosocial history, and functional impairments from a relational perspective. So we are supposed to treat mental health issues from a systems relational perspective. So with our assessment, the same is true. We're going to do assessments in order to understand the client's situation and symptoms and presenting problem from a relational perspective. Okay. Psychologists do some of this, and they also do psychological testing. That's within their scope of practice. And then psychiatrists and physicians do medical or medication evaluations. So it's important that we remain within our scope of practice and do not venture off from it, because the law delineates what our scope of practice is, and we don't want to go outside of it. Scope of competence is an ethical term that involves a therapist's responsibility to assess their own competence in assessing and addressing a given area. It is based on the individual therapist's education, training, and supervised experience, meaning that one therapist's scope of competence can be very different from another. This is different from scope of practice, where we all, as MFTs, share the same scope of practice. Okay? This also means that you can expand your scope of competence. So learning how to use different assessment tools, for example, would be expanding your scope of competence through things like training and supervision. A clear illustration of this is not using assessment tools that you're not trained to use. So this is the case for many projective drawings like the Rorschach, which you don't get enough training on to be able to use well and interpret well. So it is technically outside of your scope of competence unless you receive advanced training in order to use it. Okay, we hear about the legal and ethical duty to receive informed consent a lot in therapy, right? We know we have to get it before we start working with someone. We also need to get informed consent for our assessments. More specifically, we need to explain to the client the purpose of the assessment, the price for the assessment if we are charging, the type of assessment we're using. Is it an interview, an observation, a self-report, and so on? Limits of confidentiality associated with this particular assessment, and so on, prior to doing the assessment. Okay, this should all be explained in easy to understand language that's not full of a bunch of jargon that folks don't understand. And we also need to explain the risks and benefits of using the assessment. For example, completing a clinical interview, which is common in therapy, can be triggering for clients, and they should be informed of that prior to beginning. Crisis assessment. We are legally and ethically required to assess and intervene appropriately in the case of crisis situations. This includes assessing risk of aggression or danger to others, self-inflicted harm, or suicide. It also includes assessing for reasonable suspicion of child, elder, or dependent adult abuse. These assessments should be ongoing. So of course you would do them at the onset of therapy to assess for any crisis situations, but you would also continue to assess whenever the need arises. Okay, diagnostic assessments. So ethically, we need to use the methods, measures, and assessments that are appropriate to an individual's culture, language preference, and competence when completing diagnostic assessments. When it comes to diagnosing, it's important to remember that the DSM is based on Western assumptions, which may limit its applicability among different groups. So we need to be mindful of this to avoid misdiagnosing or pathologizing symptoms that aren't really diagnosable. We need to be mindful of how things manifest in different cultures so that we can make a proper diagnosis. Failure to consider cultural factors when we're diagnosing or when we're treating goes against our ethical codes, as you can see here with CAMP 4.6, and can result in misdiagnoses that perpetuate stereotypes based on race, ethnicity, gender, and sexual orientation. So we need to take discrimination, oppression, and racism into account when we're doing our diagnosing. Okay, evidence-based assessment. Ethically, it's important to utilize assessment techniques appropriately based on research or evidence of their usefulness and proper application. It's best when we can identify and utilize assessment tools or assessment interview protocols that have been shown to be helpful and effective by researchers. Okay, we only want to use assessment strategies and instruments that have research backing them whenever possible. Research indicating that this particular tool is reliable and valid for this particular population, meaning that it's been normed for this particular population, and under these circumstances is best practice. If you have a tool that's only ever been used with Caucasian males, this isn't probably the best tool to use with your Latina female client, right? Okay, and this brings us back to validity and reliability, which I went over in the basic concepts and assessment video. If validity and reliability haven't been established for this particular population, we need to describe the strengths and limitations of the test and its results and interpretation with the client in order to determine whether or not they even want us to go through with using it. So here's an example, okay? If you look at these questions here, you can guess that they are from a trauma questionnaire, right? Do you ever go on combat patrols or have dangerous duty? How often were you in danger of being injured or killed? So this is very clearly asking about trauma. More specifically, these questions are from the Combat Exposure Scale, which was designed for screening for trauma experienced by military personnel. So the option choices, understandably, range from no, I haven't experienced this, to 51 or more times, because it is very likely that military personnel have experienced danger of being injured or killed many, 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 many times during their duty, okay? So even if someone with no military experience has been exposed to some of these things, like danger of being injured or killed, right? Because it was normed for military people, it would be inappropriate and probably unhelpful to administer to non-military folks, right? Because their scores are very likely going to be lower than 51. And this may make it seem like they haven't experienced trauma, when in fact they have, but not to the intensity as someone who is experiencing this every single day, perhaps. According to APA, we should base our professional opinions on information and techniques that are sufficient to substantiate our findings. This means that we shouldn't provide opinions or interpretations about someone's mental health without having conducted a thorough enough assessment or exam to support these opinions. So we don't want to give opinions about people that we haven't treated, and even if we have treated them, we don't want to give those professional opinions unless we have done a thorough and complete assessment. This is where the lengthy Department of Mental Health paperwork is helpful. Though it's really, really long, it provides a wealth of information in a lot of different domains that can really help you to justify the opinions that you come up with. Once you've completed an assessment, you must interpret the results in an ethical manner. This means considering the characteristics of the person as well as the assessment itself when interpreting the results. So we wouldn't just look at those results blindly and say, well, this is what it says. Okay, so for example, if a person had a lot of questions about a self-report measure that they filled out, this may indicate that they struggled with understanding the measure, and this should be taken into account in the interpretation. The results may not be as reliable because the person didn't really understand what they were answering. This is why it's always recommended to use more than one measure and to ethically analyze the results when you're interpreting by thinking about the person's characteristics, the setting in which they took the assessment measure, and again, using more than one measure. When you're explaining assessment results, you want to make sure that you're explaining it in a way that is clear and understandable to the client. I'll back up a little bit and say you want to make sure to explain the results to the client. I think far too often we do all of these assessments and come up with all of these opinions, but we don't explain things that would be helpful for the client to know about their assessment results. So you want to be able to explain them to the client and use language that they're going to understand. And Make sure that this is beneficial for them as well, just as it's informative for you, that it's informative for your client. Now, of course, there are situations when you're not able to explain the results. Perhaps you're court mandated and you're not allowed to share them with the client. That's different, okay? But whenever possible, it is helpful and ethical to share the results and the interpretation. As an evaluator of a client, you have responsibilities. In an oversimplified nutshell, when assessing, you're responsible for selecting an appropriate assessment strategy, informing the client of the purposes and uses of the assessment, as I mentioned in informed consent, providing reasonable accommodations if necessary. Perhaps that means reading the assessment tool to the client or taking more breaks when you're doing your clinical interview. Only using techniques that you are trained to administer or interpret. So even though you think the Rorschach is really, really cool, if you've never been trained to use it, don't go in and try to use it blindly. It's not going to be helpful. Always interpret your results thoughtfully, taking the client and their culture and their social environment, and as much as you know about them into consideration, as well as the setting and any issues that arose during the assessment. And provide client with feedback in a reasonable amount of time and in clear English, if that's the language you're using, or a clear language that is appropriate for the client. According to APA's Rights and Responsibilities of Test Takers, Guidelines and Expectations document, clients have the right to be informed of their rights, obviously, to know why they're being assessed, okay, and which assessments are being used, to know and accept the consequences of the results, even though they may not like them, to have the results explained to them, and to know that their results remain confidential. Their responsibilities are to take the tests or to respond to the assessments honestly, and to inform you, the therapist, of anything that might affect the results. Okay, so bringing it back to this class, what can you learn? You'll have the opportunity to learn about how to select and administer appropriate assessments, how to develop a psychosocial history, mental status exam, treatment plan, and progress notes, how to understand the importance of assessments and evidence-based practice, and to apply professional and ethical principles in the assessment of diverse clients. So that is all stuff you have to look forward to. Thanks for listening. As always, you can reach out if you have any questions.